It's clear in listening to the testimony that we had some significant challenges before us to get through this census. Some of these issues emerged early. I would argue that part of the problem was the fact that the Republican Congress in place from 2012 to 2016 underinvested in the census. And as many of you mentioned, early investments are critically important for getting an accurate count at the end. Then we had the COVID pandemic hit that added even more challenges that made that problem even more apparent. In addition, and I've heard from some of you about Trump administration interference, and clearly we saw that firsthand in the final months and weeks as the administration actually cut the census short when we were trying to make sure the time was taken to actually make sure that we have an accurate count. It was cut short. This occurred despite a lot of pushback from myself and my colleagues, as well as all of you on the ground who are saying we need to make sure we do this right. Let's not cut this short. That's what happened. My question then for all of the witnesses, and I'll start with you, Mayor Duggan, and then I think we just go down the table in the order that you're at. You've already discussed some of the top challenges, but I think for the committee record, it's important for us to hear, what was the top one or two challenges that were really very difficult in your community or the communities that you serve that we certainly want to focus on all the challenges, but what are the two things that really stand out that we need to be focused on? Mayor?
Well, as a number of the witnesses have indicated, we had an enormous community effort going. The problem was entirely the central staffing, and there were some dedicated workers working for the Census Bureau, lifetime Detroiters who are out there, and they were telling us, we can't get our lists. And then as it got to be September and they were behind, they started getting messages from the Census Bureau, $500 relocation fee if you'll move to Indiana. They actually, at the time Detroit was the furthest behind, the Census Bureau was incentivizing lifetime Detroiters to move to another state. And probably the most depressing thing, and something I hope somebody will look into, but in May, the Census Bureau had decided to go from 10 weeks to 7 weeks non-response follow-up. But in May, they said, we are going to put resources in 12 states to start a week early. Add a week to the non-response follow-up. We were excited. We're going to gear up early. They're genuinely trying. And then when they announced where the extra week was in the state of Michigan, it was in Oakland County. Now, at the time, Oakland County had a 77% response rate. Detroit had a 49% response rate. And the Census Bureau said, we're going to put extra counting effort in to the state of Michigan, and it's going to go to Oakland County. And this was it, no matter what everybody here did. When the people who are actually running the program stick their thumb on the scale, it just became impossible to overcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Marinoff, what did you see? What is a significant challenge or two?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we've talked about some of these. We've talked about the uncertainty related to the pandemic. We also talked about the uncertainty and chaos from the proposal to add a citizenship question. One thing we didn't touch on as much was the budgetary uncertainty that the census faced, especially in the years leading up to the census, which led to the cancellation of some tests and programs, one of them being the active block resolution program, which would have more effectively guided the field operation. But as the mayor was pointing out, I think the biggest challenge here or the set of challenges were the ones associated with the non-response follow-up operation. There was this emphasis in the 2020 census for the first time on internet self-response. As the mayor already indicated in his testimony, that created real disparities, especially in Black and brown communities where people had less access to the internet. It also led to a lower self-response rate citywide in 2020 than we had in 2010, when it was more of a paper pencil operation. And I just also want to emphasize that in our data, this housing audit that I talked about, we found that the housing undercount that we documented was 3.5 times more pronounced in neighborhoods with the lowest self-response rates. That's where less than a quarter of the residents were able to self-respond to the census, compared to those in the highest neighborhoods with the highest self-response rates, where over 3/4 were able to self-respond on the internet. These are the places that need the most field work, the most non-response follow-up operation. And the very powerful statements attached to the mayor's testimony from census workers really show clearly that they were not getting it. It was late getting started, early ending, but it was also mismanaged along the way. And I think what's illuminating here is that the census has already showed us, the Census Bureau, that when you have to do more non-response follow-up, you're likely to get less accurate population counts. We're showing that that also holds true for housing counts. That one of the reasons why we're not counting enough population is that we're not sending enough field workers out to actually enumerate the housing units, which is then translating into an undercount in the population. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Yes, Senator, it's hard to add anything after the mayor and Dr. Morehouse speaks, but I would like to add that, you know, as Ms. Garcia mentioned in her testimony, Census closed offices. And historically, there have been people between 2010, 2020, or folk who you worked with, you were involved with, they were part of the community, they knew the community, and you had a relationship with them. And so those ongoing year-round relationships were lost when offices were closed and staff were relocated, and you started hiring people who were not familiar, or as the mayor said, were incentivized to leave the community. I think there were mixed messaging. The messages that were out there were questions about citizenship, questions about whether the census is going to end early or continue on. The messaging that the community was hearing, they hear us, and as Ms. Kuhn was saying, the community is making all of this effort. Nonprofits are talking to people, and then we are being challenged by what others are saying. So I would add that that was part of the problem for making sure the census count was accurate.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia.
Yes, thank you, Senator. One of the things I think is real important, like we had mentioned, presence is going to be very important as we move forward, and we don't have the presence today. I think the immediately of a presence of some kind of a regional offices, maybe that can continue. Nowhere in our history had we ever seen the government cut 50% of any governmental units in an area. I mean, they went from 12 regional offices to 6. That just added to the confusion. I also think that as you look forward, Senator, that you look at the people that are at the Bureau of the Census, and please don't put the people that are at the Bureau of the Census in charge of the 2030. Obviously, I'm not very confident that the ones that were in charge did a good job for 2020. So I think all that needs to be really looked at, because I think it's very important that partnerships be emphasized, because partnerships and relationships to making sure that whether it's the Indian reservations or our local communities that do not get left out, because there is a relationship that we continue to build on that. So I would appreciate that, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ms. Fresh.
So, Senator, for us, I mean, a lot has been said, of course, but the main thing I want to re-emphasize here for our community in particular, the biggest challenge was the fear and mistrust that developed in the community because of the politicization of the operations of the census. And so, and of course, you know, having a pandemic and dealing with an immigrant community that has barriers in terms of language. With the pandemic, people needed access to Wi-Fi. They needed to be comfortable with using digital tools. All these, I would say they were major special challenges during the 2020 census, in particular for our community. And in addition, you know, the funding level and investment from the Census Bureau was not really implemented as it was originally planned for. So investment in community-based efforts to have education campaigns and field workers that will reach out to community members and hold them by the arm and gain their trust to make sure that they do fill the census were cut short, and the efforts that were done actually were funded by private foundations and state government. So I would say these two areas are the biggest challenges we faced.
Right. Thank you. Ms. Kuhn.
Thank you. From the very beginning, just echoing what has already been said, there was a lot of confusion, misinformation, and a lack of understanding of how the census data was and how it's to be used for. Also, what has already been stated, the lack of trust. When we think about trust in federal and local government, for some it was about experiences in countries from which they've immigrated, as well as experiences that they've had while being in the U.S. And lastly, there were security concerns and lack of understanding of how protected the data is. And these were concerns throughout the campaign that we experienced and were very difficult to overcome in the communities that we were working with.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this question of all the witnesses again, and we're just going to keep the same format. Mayor Duggan will kick it off. We raised a number of challenges, and I want to drill deeper into these challenges because we make improvements and also have an opportunity to fix what may not have worked the first time because it has a significant impact on communities, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that. But before we do that, I think it's also important for us to focus on some successes. We had a lot of great work. All of you were involved in a lot of great work here on the ground to get out the work. So I would like each of you to mention what you think was a success in the 2020 census, what was perhaps an improvement from 2010, and perhaps some local efforts that we should look at as a model going forward for future census. Because clearly we did a lot of great things on the ground. Mayor, you were instrumental here. I know there were a lot of great successes in the city of Detroit. I'd like to hear a little bit of that for the committee's benefit.
Well, in the city and statewide, I've never seen the level of cooperation. We had the Latino community, the Arab American community, the Asian communities. You go right down the list, the Bengali communities. We had people out with trusted voices everywhere. And I think it did pay off statewide. Across the state of Michigan, there was an uptick, and it was because of all of the efforts that you heard about today. And I think there's a lot to be proud of in the community effort. The problem was the people actually in charge of counting weren't there, but I think everybody up here ought to take credit for really what turned out to be a remarkable number statewide.
Dr. Marno?
Yeah, thank you. I would echo everything the mayor just said and also add a few thoughts of my own. First of all, just the mere fact that the 2020 census was completed as close to schedule as it was is a major accomplishment. And despite all the criticisms I have of the way that the 2020 census was operated, especially locally, the Bureau itself and the really fine data scientists and people working at the Census Bureau deserve a ton of credit for adopting to the most difficult of circumstances. They also deserve credit for some planning in the years leading up to the census, really early on, as some of our witnesses have talked about. These include things like the increased use of field automation, the wider use of administrative records in census processes, a modernization of the way they develop address lists, increased use of internet response, and this new non-ID processing system, which made it more feasible for people to complete a census return anytime, anywhere, without requiring contact in the mail or by an enumerator. The problem is that these are things that work very well nationally on a global scale, but the census count is really a hyper-local phenomenon, and they don't work equally well everywhere. And as we've already talked about, in places where so many people have trouble accessing the internet, where administrative records may not be as complete and accurate as they are in other parts of the country, we can't depend on these innovative, but in other places, very successful efforts. So we need more work on things like the ground game, the non-response follow-up operation, which we've already talked about. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, I think, as I said in my written testimony, I thought I did give commendations to some of the regional staff that were in place, the professionalism that they, in spite of political interference, they persevered and pressed on to get the job done. So, we don't ignore or don't give recognition to that. But I also thought it was helpful and very significant that Mayor put resources in place, hiring Vicky Cavari and others, and got the community involved in thinking about the census very early. It was important that the Michigan Nonprofit Association received significant support As Kelly indicated, $10 million plus from state and other monies were made available. So we were able to run commercials, to use social media, and do a number of things to try to bring the census alive to the community and make sure people knew about what was happening. I thought those were all important steps that were made toward the census this year, 2020.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia?
I think that one of the things that were real positive, it could have been a lot worse, Senator, had we not had all these people on the ground. It could have been a lot worse. So I think that when you look at that aspect, all the work that the nonprofits did kind of picked up the ball where the government wasn't present here. So they're the ones that, whether people like it or not, and there was an undercount, and historically there's been an undercount. So it's just an issue of the trust, the issue of people did not answer the doors automatically, and during the pandemic it got worse. People did not come to the doors, so the enumeration was very difficult for the people that were hired for the enumeration. But I think that all the work that the nonprofits did, I think did help. And I think that the issue was that it could have been a lot worse. That's what I keep looking at that aspects. And I think the networks that were made between the nonprofits to know that how important, because we've been working on this for a long time, to know how important it was, I thought developed that network that also brought the Bureau of the Census questions to them and saying, hey, we need this, we need that. It was very late coming. And they used to have an advisory board in Washington, and that was eliminated during the 2020. So there was a lot of things that could have been worse. So when you look at that aspects, I think that because of our partnerships, that we may have not gotten the number that we wanted or the number that we know that we should have, but at least it could have been a lot worse, Senator. Gracias.
For me, Senator, I'm a big fan of the resilience and the innovation of communities on the ground. Any grassroots kind of efforts, where they need to be celebrated and emphasized. So for me, the work of the Michigan Complete Count Committee and our partnership with the Michigan Nonprofit Association is really truly something to celebrate and to replicate all over the country in the future. We had so much success in Michigan. It was truly a partnership between communities, government, businesses, and private foundations. We all came together and we made sure that we reached out to community-based organizations in 82 of the counties out of the 83 counties in Michigan, and we made sure that they are provided with the resources that they need to make them effective at running the education campaigns and the field work that will allow them to be impactful in engaging with the constituencies that they are serving, and thus increase the participation response from those communities. So this is something that in my book needs to be celebrated a great deal and needs to be replicated all over the country in the 2020 census.
Schoon.
Thank you. I'll just add that one of the big successes for our campaign was the multiple ways for people to fill out the census. We appreciated the intentional effort to have materials in various language. We found that very helpful. Also, I think it's important to lift up a very great example of some local efforts, keeping in mind that on April 1st, 2020, we designated that as Census Day. So imagine within a few days of the lockdown, nearly every planned census event was canceled, and the effects rippled throughout communities around the state. In Detroit alone, at least 90 census promotional events were canceled and replaced by virtual phone banks run by the city's census captains. With original plans on hold indefinitely, nonprofit organizations changed course. For example, groups began distributing census information on flyers through programs such as Gleaners Community Food Banks, Community Food Distribution Sites, Meals on Wheels, and Detroit Area Agency on Aging. Along with the census information, organizations also doled out gloves, masks, hand sanitizers, and social distance reminders to help mitigate COVID-19 transmission in the city, which was devastated by the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Ms. Kuhn. I want to kind of continue to talk a little bit about community outreach efforts before we tackle some other important issues. The Bureau certainly seemed to work to forge some relationships through their partnership program. Some of you have alluded to that in your testimony. They did some targeted advertising in local media. They provided the census in 13 different languages. However, I think we all agree, and I certainly heard this from most of you, that they were slow when it came to providing in-person types of contacts, which are particularly critical for hard-to-count areas. They were slow to set up assistance centers, especially in those areas with less internet access, which is what we find here clearly in the city of Detroit. We pushed the Bureau. We did provide additional funding for those assistance centers. However, I don't think that was ever fully implemented, unfortunately, by the folks who were running that, and it should have been. But what I'd like to ask each of you is that when it comes to community outreach specifically, is there something you would have added that just simply wasn't done by the Census Bureau that they should have done to help us reach particularly hard to count folks in the city of Detroit as well as other places around the state? Mayor, what would you suggest?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go back to my time in 1980 as a follow-up response enumerator, knocking on doors in Ann Arbor. And pre-computer, they gave me a stack of blank forms and 300 addresses, and those were my assignments for the week. And I went and knocked on doors in neighborhoods, in racially mixed neighborhoods in Ann Arbor. And anybody who wants to tell you about the theory about racial undercount, I saw it firsthand. When the government knocks on the doors of Black and brown families and wants to know who lives in the house, how much do you make, and what your jobs are, they are more distrustful of the government rep knocking on the door than Caucasians are. That's just the truth. There's been a lot of studies to show it, but I feel like I can relate to anybody. I saw it firsthand, and I don't think the Census Bureau can do it. I think it has to be the groups like these. It has to be the trusted voices. And I think it's something that, with the exception of the outreach getting stopped by the COVID, we did well. We had every single group in the city. We had trusted voices in the community, at the neighborhood events. And so I don't blame the Census Bureau for that. I think the trusted voice outreach has to come from us. That's where the partnership needs to be. We just want to make sure once the trusted voices say, do this, somebody actually shows up at the door and takes your information.
Thank you, Mayor. Warnoff?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Senator Peters. My colleagues on this panel know a tremendous amount about community outreach and can speak from their perspectives much more strongly to this than I can. So I'm going to take a more expansive view of the question here and talk about community outreach in the form of interfacing between the Census Bureau and local governments. And I want to talk about something called the Local Update of Census Address Operation, or the LUCA operation, which takes place in the years leading up to the census, particularly in 2018 and 2019. And this was created in 1994 by Congress through the Census Address List Improvement Act, which was really revolutionary at the time. It gave local governments an opportunity to review the address list that the census was using to go out and do its enumeration. And I can assure you, if we didn't have that in place, the results would be even worse. The problem is that it's only a limited opportunity to review those lists, and that window of opportunity ends before the census operation begins in around 2019. So as the mayor alluded to in his testimony, we saw that the count that the Census Bureau had in its master address file in 2019 dropped by over 58,000 housing units in the 2020 census, but we don't know how because the city or researchers are not allowed to see the update of the master address file. So I think that Congress can play a really constructive role here in expanding the LUCA operation, the local update of census addresses, by going back and revisiting that really important 1994 legislation and providing for a more continual partnership between local governments and the Census Bureau in developing and updating the master address file, which could really help lead to a more accurate count and fewer mistakes of the kind that we're seeing in Detroit.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, I would just try to say this as succinctly as possible, but certainly seek or maintain community partnerships leading up to the census. Try to maintain the simplicity, and technology can only improve. I mean, what we had this April 1st and the opportunity to go online and within 5 minutes or less complete the census, I would imagine that going forward, that process could be even more simplified.
Thank you.
Senator, I will go back to the resources. I think that's very important. I did 4 censuses, and I think of all the censuses that I did, 2000 was one of the best, and it's because they poured all the resources they could for the accurate count, for the return addresses, follow-up. I mean, they just spend a lot of money to make sure that we had an accurate count. We still had an undercount, but it would have been a lot worse. And I think you have to depend on the resources, and they should start, like, not 2 years before the next census, but ongoing, some sort of ongoing through the whole decade, so that by the time you hit 2 years before the census, people aren't afraid to at least understand and educate them to understand why they have to fill out the census and how important it is to their community, whether they put up a new school or they put up a new clinic. And I think that that is something that's very important. We deal with migrants, and migrants come and go, and we want to make sure they're counted where they're living at the time of April 1st. So those are the things that I think needs to be in place so that we can improve how our numbers are for the state and how much resources will come back for the next 10 years.
For me, I want to re-emphasize how Mayor Dallin answered this question. Really, it is about, at the end of the day, we know that the Census Bureau is a professional, institution with very, very talented scientists who put and put together the digital tools and the data security tools and had major linguistic kind of tools that were provided to the communities. The only issue is that the dissemination of these resources cannot and couldn't be done in an effective way by those professionals, and there is a need to depend on community-based, trusted voices that can take these tools and make sure that they are disseminated to the actual participants and communities that these organizations serve. So that's my main response to this one.
I will just add a couple things. I would consider starting earlier with the partnership specialists in communities. Some communities, they were very successful, and others we had not so much success. Also, when thinking about that as the Bureau gears up for 2030, they should take into consideration maybe more ethnic census field workers to create greater trust in these communities, as many of us have said on the panel. And lastly, we'd also like to see a stronger role for ethnic and non-traditional media in the overall communications plan, especially for small media outlets. Michigan has a robust network, which is an asset. Not many other states have that, and we should take advantage of their trust and reach in community.
Thank you. I have a more directed question here just to Ms. Frage, related to the Arab American population and some of the unique challenges of counting that community. I've certainly been fighting for a long time to have a separate category for people of Middle Eastern and North African descent, which we call the MENA category. And we were making some real progress with a long fight up through 2016 until the Trump administration basically put a halt to that and ended that program. We're continuing the fight, however, as you know, and I'm happy to say that OMB has now elevated this as a priority, and in June announced that they're going to begin the process to revise these standards, which I think are very encouraging.
Yes.
But I'd like to have you speak on the record as to how do you believe that OMB, including the MENA category in the standard, is going to help not only the Census Bureau, but also other federal agencies collect more accurate and more inclusive data that we need in order to make sure we deal with the unique needs of this community.
Thank you so much for this question, Senator. As I said earlier, we remain hopeful and expectant that the OMB will move to establish a MENA category across the federal government when they revise the federal standards for data on race and ethnicity. Our expectation is due in large part to your steadfast support for the civil and human right of our community to statistical recognition and political representation. So thank you very much for your leadership, Senator. There are two main ways we think that a MENA category will help all federal agencies collect more accurate and inclusive data. First, the Census Bureau already tested the practical utility and statistical validity of a MENA response category. In the 2015 National Content Test, they found it captured the survey responses of those in the MENA working definition. It did not capture the responses of those who could have thought they were MENA, but were not in the working definition. And it made more individuals, particularly Black and Hispanic individuals, sure of their self-identification. These findings cast into stark reality that the MENA category is just a good statistical category and it resonates with a discrete population that is conscious of itself in its terms. It is unambiguous and it improves census response rates. Second, through the direct service work of Access and other MENA community serving organizations within the National Network for Arab American Communities, we have observed that individuals of MENA descent tend to share certain characteristics not yet captured in federal data. Namely, individuals of MENA descent tend to have limited English proficiency, limited access to capital, poor or desperate health outcomes, and barriers to established pathways to sustained and intergenerational academic and professional achievement. A MENA category would allow the litany of federal policies and programs that rely upon racial and ethnic data to recognize and address these conditions in their authorized activities. In conclusion, a MENA category provides for more accurate and inclusive data from a statistical perspective and increases the use of value statistical products across all federal agencies.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the Census Bureau has now released some key census results, including undercount data. And despite the previous administration's interference, which all of you have referred to, the career officials certainly persisted to take some time to process the data, and they've also released many studies about the quality of that data, as you know. Unfortunately, the data have revealed nationwide undercounts for many groups, especially minorities. I think the mayor alluded to these numbers in your testimony, Mayor. Black people were undercounted by over 3%, Latinos by nearly 5%, which is 3 times the 2010 undercount. There were also undercounts for Native Americans, Asian Americans, young people, people who rent their homes, and so much more. The Bureau, unfortunately, does not tabulate local level undercounts. And this has clearly very serious, I'm going to emphasize serious implications for Michigan and some of our communities. Dr. Martinoff, I'm going to start with you. You've described your study on the likely undercount here in Detroit. My question to you is, how does this compare to other cities? How does this fit in to the national undercount data that has now been released by the Census Bureau?
Yes, thank you, Senator Peters, and thank you also for emphasizing the need for more local data on these metrics for how the census is performing, the post-enumeration survey in particular. So first, in some ways, the problems that were encountered in Detroit are emblematic of national trends. In other ways, it's really unique. So let me start with the commonalities. I see at least three commonalities. One of them we've already referred to, which is the undercounting of Black and brown people, and the mayor already gave you those specific numbers. Another group that maybe receives less attention than it needs to is households that are renting housing are undercounted relative to households that own their housing. And Detroit is a majority renter city. So that's important to emphasize. And then the third one is one that I've already referred to, but I'll say again, that areas with lower self-response rates tend to get undercounted relative to areas with higher self-response rates. And Detroit was last in terms of the top 50 cities in its self-response rate. So those are all ways that Detroit fits into the national pattern, but there are also really important ways where it's a unique anomaly. And when you look, and I provide a lot of this data in my written testimony, but when you look at a comparison of, say, the 50 largest cities and look at the population loss, the nearest comparable cities are places like Phoenix, San Antonio, Miami. What those places have in common are very large proportions of foreign-born populations and Latino populations in particular. And I'm not saying that this is not a factor in Detroit, it certainly is, but not to the extent that it is in these other cities where probably the kerfuffle over the introduction of the proposed introduction of the citizenship question and the profound distrust that developed as a result of that had really profound effects on the undercount. What makes Detroit distinct is that among all these cities, it was the only one that experienced not only a severe drop in its population count, but also an even more severe drop in its housing count. And I think this is important because some other people might say, well, maybe this is just a result of the pandemic and people leaving the city. And there's two reasons why I don't think this is an explanation for what happened in the 2020 census. One of them is that if you look at national trends, the cities that lost the most population due to the pandemic, that happened in the subsequent year, 2020 to 2021. And the second reason is that the pandemic might provide an account for why people are leaving cities, but it doesn't provide an account for why housing units are being dropped from the books. And that's what's happening in Detroit. And so this tie-in to like the population undercount being driven by the housing undercount really points to some unique circumstances that I think are really more reflective of the field operations that weren't going out and counting enough people in these housing units.
Well, thank you. Actually, I've been reviewing this excellent report you put out, the analysis of the Census 2020 count in Detroit from the University of Michigan, December 2021. This is an incredibly comprehensive document that really takes a look at the undercount that occurred here in Detroit and how significant it is and reasons. I'm going to enter this into the congressional record here from the hearing so that we can refer to that. But I certainly want to applaud the work that the University of Michigan has done on this issue.
Thank you so much, Senator Peters. I and my colleagues greatly appreciate that.
I know it's a group effort, but we appreciate everybody. Mayor Duggan, as we've discussed, the study that we've entering into the record here shows undercounted households in some Detroit neighborhoods by as much as 8.1%, over 8%. And we know Detroit is home to many of the groups that has been discussed that are undercounted on the national level. Majority African-American city, a high percentage of renters, diversity. But I think it's important for this committee and for folks to realize what the impact of this undercount will mean to the city of Detroit. Why we have to get this right. This certainly has significant implications. Could you explain on the record for why we have to get this right?
Well, we've been cut already, $10 million a year nearly in state revenue sharing for police, fire, and other services. And virtually every aspect of the federal government, from housing to hot lunch to Medicaid funding, is driven by it. And here is, to me, the most interesting thing about what we've seen. I've noticed with interest at the Pentagon. has acknowledged the possibility of UFOs and is starting to study them. To me, the Census Bureau numbers in Detroit are even more remarkable. They've proven the existence of ghosts because DTE has 280,000 housing units that are paying their light and gas bill, and the Census Bureau says we have fewer than 255,000 households. And so who's occupying these other 25,000 households paying the gas and light bills? And so there's two possibilities. We've either been invaded by a group of ghosts, or the Census Bureau data is wrong. And Senator, all I keep asking for is the same thing. If we can have an appeal process where we can bring in objective data like the University of Michigan report that you just entered into the record, no reasonable person will conclude that our number is correct. And here's the thing that aggravates me. Why are we a year and a half later? It's not that complicated. You write something that says, if you believe you were undercounted, here are the kinds of outside objective evidence data points that you can present, and we will consider them. And with the annual estimates now, there's even less defense. Here's what they do when they jump from 21 to 22. There's no privacy involved. They run a math calculation, birth rates, death rates, permits, how many people filed income taxes, how many people were on Medicare. It's a straight calculation. There is no way in the world 7,000 people left the city of Detroit in the last year. There is nothing secret about that calculation. Have them put the calculation out there and let us then objectively, I don't want any special treatment. All I want is to show you clearly and objectively what we have, but there's no urgency. If I were a banker sitting in front of your committee with clear evidence that we had discriminated racially among the people that we were making loans to, you and Congress would be outraged and demand immediate action from the federal government. We are sitting here a year and a half later with people being discriminated against because of their color in the city of Detroit, and the Census Bureau hasn't even put out an appeal process. It's time we hold our own government to the same level of urgency to address racism that we would for any private company. And I'm hoping that's what comes out of this hearing.
Well, absolutely, Mayor. There's no question we have to get this right. And as you said, it's not special treatment. It's just being treated fairly. Make sure you count every individual that's there. And in hard to count areas, these are folks who need to be counted without question. And so, as you know, we've been fighting this for some time, and I certainly believe that state, local, tribal governments all need to have meaningful opportunities across the country to challenge the census where it's appropriate and where there's objective data to back up their assertions. I pushed to create some of these programs. In fact, so after my advocacy last year, the Bureau has created the post-census group quarters review program, which does allow localities to submit new data for missing group quarters like nursing homes, colleges, prisons. That data is going to be part of the annual population estimates, as you know, and which is a basis for federal funding.
Good step the right direction.
So we've taken that first step. But as like all good solutions, they usually require more than one step, but it doesn't start until the first step. So we've started it with the first step, and we're trying to push the Bureau to expand the Population Estimates Challenge Program to give you more opportunities to have that input for the data. So my question for you, Mayor, is how has the city participated in the existing program to help with the undercount, including the count question resolution program and this new group quarters review program? And do you believe that will provide some help for residents?
Yeah, and I would defer to Professor Mornoff, who's more into that, but we have filed an appeal on that. We do believe that there are such clear mistakes on that. We will get some relief from that, but it's actually only allows us to appeal a small part of the problem. And Professor Mornoff could probably describe the appeal better than I can.
Yeah, so the mayor is referring to the count question resolution program, which allows local entities to challenge the results of the decennial census, the 2020 census. And the problem is that the grounds on which you can mount those challenges are very narrow. There's only really two types of challenges you can mount. One of them is what they call boundary issues. That's when you're contesting like the geography of where a certain housing unit was counted. And we thankfully didn't really have many of those issues in Detroit. The other one are housing issues, and we did have a lot of those in Detroit. And so the way to challenge the population count is through challenging the housing count. That's the way that the census sets it up. And that is what led to that extensive auditing of housing that we did. I worked with folks at the city to help run that process, and we did an extensive look at all the housing units on a set of blocks that we were challenging. So that process is now in operation. It's being reviewed by the census. But as the mayor points out, what's really important looking forward, in addition to the group quarters challenge, which is a critically important new addition to this process, and is also something that we are in the process of working on, and we've actually through a lot of groundwork now, my colleagues have found like hundreds of people living in group quarters beds that we think were unaccounted for in the census. So that challenge is forthcoming. There's also going to be a challenge, we hope, to the population estimates program, but we need the census to reinstate that program and to also expand the way that it allows for challenges to occur, because there are some nuances to those rules that are frankly that kind of handcuff local governments. Like for one of them is called the county cap rule, which is that if Detroit wants to challenge its population count, the Census Bureau might adjust the population estimate, but only in a way that the overall population for the county doesn't change. So adding more people to Detroit would mean taking people away from the rest of Wayne County, and that is just patently not the way to go about this. It's absurd.
Well, I'd like to expand, if you would. You have these existing options that you're pursuing now, but specifically, what should the Census Bureau do right now to provide an opportunity for the city of Detroit and any other community in the state of Michigan to challenge the count? What specifically? This is both the mayor and to Dr. Mornoff both.
We would like a very clear process that says, one, you can challenge the decennial census, the 2020 census. We know we cannot project ourselves back in time, which is what makes challenging census counts from April of 2020 so hard, but that we can present outside objective data. The director, Director Census, has already said the count was wrong. All I want is a chance to present objective data on what was right. And so it could be things like housing permits. It could be things like inspections. It could be things like the University of Michigan door-to-door study. It could be things like DTE's records on electricity. What we would like the ability to do is say, here's what we think the accurate count is. Here's the objective data, and you can verify it. It's not us complaining. And then on the annual estimates, which in some ways may turn out to be more devastating to us because they affect our federal money every year, make the formula public and let us challenge that with objective data. That's all we want, is transparency and the ability to present objective data. And Professor Mornoff can talk more about the data we want, but we don't want to do anything except objective, verifiable data to challenge these numbers.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to that. I think the mayor put it very succinctly. We do need more transparency and the ability to marshal the appropriate types of data that the Census Bureau will look at and match up to their data, and really, provide a fair comparison between what they counted and what we see as objective evidence of the number of people and the number of housing units in the city. And I continue to work with the city to try to marshal as much of that administrative data as we can, things like building permits, demolition permits. We're really trying to make sure, and I think every city, unfortunately, this process places a huge burden on cities to kind of do this on their own. And it would be helpful if the census shared more of its own data with cities, so that, I mean, I've just been thoroughly impressed, but also astounded by how much time and effort the city has put into this process. And I don't know that many other cities have that same ability to mount this kind of a challenge. And that's not the way the system should work. It should be open for all cities to kind of examine the data and to challenge it if it's found to be inappropriate.
So, Mr. Chairman, think about how easy this would be in simple terms. We do not want the Census Bureau to disclose the personal data of which houses were occupied. I think the protection of privacy is critical for future census count. But think about the Boston Edison neighborhood. 500 houses in that neighborhood. The Census Bureau says 399 were occupied. The post office says 480 were occupied. Our door-to-door survey says 486. DTE probably says 470. What I would like to do is be able to hand the Census Bureau the DTE data house by house, which ones are occupied, the post office data house by house, which ones are occupied, and our door-to-door survey data house by house, which one is occupied. They can match that up against their own census data, and they will see that houses they say are empty, the postman's delivering, the lights are on, and the door-to-door surveyors found people in there. That is going to be an occupied house. It wouldn't be that hard if we were to give that data to the Census Bureau for them to match it against their actual count and see where the undercounts are. What we're asking for is not complicated in today's world, but it requires them to have a willingness to do something they've never done, which is admit their count is not the most accurate and consider multiple objective verifiable sources from the outside.
Certainly very reasonable. And we will make that request, and I will be talking to the director, and we're going to be talking about what we have learned at this hearing. We're running out of time, so I just maybe throw out, and anybody can jump in on this, just some final thoughts that you would like to leave this committee with, and know that those thoughts will be delivered to the Census Bureau and could possibly translate into legislation or other activities that are taken. I'm going to start down, and you don't have to jump in if you don't like, but we'll start with Ms. Kuhn, because I'm in the great city of Detroit, and the mayor of Detroit always will get the last word when I'm in the city of Detroit.
Sure. Just a couple last thoughts. Having had the opportunity to hear Census Director Robert Santos speak, we're encouraged by his approach and lived experience with the communities we work with. Also, we will encourage the Bureau to start early with ethnic communities and work with trusted allies already in community to better understand the people and their needs. We also support the Bureau having a sufficient budget to carry out its work, as we've talked about here today. We'd also like to see the census revisit the race ethnicity categories to be more inclusive of identities that are not white, and I'm thinking more specifically of the MENA designation. And finally, we'd like to see more transparency on census tract completion rates for outreach purposes, as we've talked about. Those are our final thoughts.
For me, what I would like to, the final thoughts I would like to leave everybody with is really for this committee to deal with the elephant in the room, the importance of protecting the science mission of the Census Bureau and its independence from any political interference is something that we need to pay attention to, and we need to make sure we build the safeguards that will accomplish that. And of course, ensuring that there are adequate funding at all levels to allow the scientists to come up with the tools that are needed to have a successful count and to be able to invest in resources within the local communities that will ensure an accurate count, especially in the communities that are very hard to reach. So these are the two areas that I would leave everybody with.
Senator, one of the things that I think would be really important to know is that the challenges from the cities and urban cities like Detroit have been challenged in the past. Coleman Young actually sued the Census Bureau, and they did come back with a more accurate count. I think they had lost like 50,000, and they were able to bring it back. And I just think so precedents have been set, even though it's timely, costly. So if there's another way to do it by an appeal process that's opened, you know, beginning and end would be real important when we look at moving forward, because are hampered with these numbers for 10 years. And you know, even the estimates, it doesn't have that much of an impact. They can say estimates, but it doesn't say census numbers. So I think that would be something at least that you as our senator could actually advocate, that we have an appeal process, because there's so many people that are unhappy with the count. Thank you.
Mr. Anderson.
Once again, Senator, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to participate in this hearing. I would add that the Urban League would support, as the mayor has been talking about, and Professor Morehouse has been talking about, I'm sorry, to extend broad flexibility in how you review local challenges to the 2020 census count. It just seems logical and common sense that if the household count that they have is significantly different than the one that the utilities have, that you could make some adjustment and accountability. And the other point I just want to make is one that I mentioned during the testimony, that states like Illinois, California, Colorado, and others have ways of allowing prison counts to enhance the local community count. In Michigan, that would require the state legislature to pass legislation that abolishes prison gerrymander. But I think that's something that, as a community and a state, particularly those of us in the city of Detroit, would want to advocate to happening before the next census takes place.
Thank you. More enough?
Yes, thank you. First, I'm going to just underscore the points that the mayor ended his last comment with about ways that the Census Bureau could allow local governments like Detroit to just clearly bring data on each specific address in the city where it feels that a challenge is necessary to line up against the census data. And one thing I neglected to emphasize in my prior comment is right now, we're allowed to bring data to challenge the existence of a housing structure, but we're not allowed to challenge the occupancy of that structure. And we also have data that speak to the occupancy, and that data should be brought to bear to do that kind of comparison that the mayor was talking about. Also, from a researcher perspective, there are two things I just want to end with. One of them is a point that Senator Peters already made, which is that like the census conducts a very thorough post-enumeration survey after the census is done to evaluate gaps in the coverage. And it would be super helpful if those results could be made available at a more local level so we can see whether national trends apply to Detroit and other local entities throughout the country, and how the errors in coverage might be different in those places. And then finally, this is a point that's made by the task force on census data quality at the national academies, that the census, in part because of all the innovations it's introduced, has a lot more really nice operational metrics now that allow researchers and evaluators to kind of dig deep into how the census is conducting its operations. And those measures should also be shared at a local enough level that we can see things like how much of the non-response follow-up effort was happening in Detroit. How many of these cases were being sent out to in-field address canvassing instead of just in-office address canvassing, which is happening behind a computer screen. But how many people are actually going out into these neighborhoods? And how many of these cases are being resolved by resorting to proxy interviews, trying to find other people in the neighborhood to talk to about whether a given housing unit was occupied on census day, versus actually knocking on the doors and talking to the people directly. These are all metrics that the Census Bureau is working on, but they have to be released at a fine-grained enough level for us to really understand what's happening in these local areas.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Chairman, I want to start by thanking you for taking the time to hold this important hearing locally so that the community can participate. And I would just close by saying this. We have an administration in the White House that is committed to its core to racial justice. There's no question about that. We have leadership in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House right now that have proven over and over again by their actions that they're committed to racial justice. We have leadership at the Census Bureau that doesn't seem to have any urgency to correct the racial inequities that are there. And it's my hope that what comes out of this hearing is that the values that are shared by the Biden administration and by you and your colleagues in the Senate and your colleagues in the House, that we put a spotlight on the Census Bureau and get some urgency and just give us a chance to present some facts and appeal. That's all I want. Thank you.